This final week of August is changing the entire month. In what feels like a blink, August is already almost over. But do not make the mistake of mentally moving into September yet, because these final days will absolutely shock you. From August 23rd through the 31st, we enter the most influential stretch of August. So if August has felt unfinished, confusing, or strangely uneventful in certain areas, don't assume you've already seen its final answer, because we're only getting started. The biggest mistake you could make right now is assuming that August has already settled into its final shape. It hasn't. We still have the second eclipse of the month coming on August 28th, a partial lunar eclipse, and even after that, this final stretch still has more waiting for us. Eclipse periods have long been associated in astrology with turning points, reversals, and circumstances becoming visible from a completely different angle. And because this eclipse arrives so close to the end of the month, there is very little distance between the disruption and whatever follows it. That is what makes these final days so interesting. August is not quietly fading out. It is compressing some of its biggest movement into the very end, which means the story of this month is still unfinished, even if it feels like we are already at the exit. August 28th is important because the full moon and the partial lunar eclipse are not two random events happening on the same day. A lunar eclipse can only happen during a full moon, because that is the moment when Earth moves between the sun and the moon, and part of Earth's shadow falls across the lunar surface. So, astronomically, this is one event with two layers. The moon reaches fullness at the exact time part of its light is being interrupted. And spiritually, that creates a very different meaning from a normal full moon. A full moon is usually associated with visibility, culmination, and seeing something clearly, while an eclipse introduces obstruction, uncertainty, and a temporary loss of the full picture. That tension is what makes this date interesting, because something can be reaching its peak while still refusing to reveal everything at once. Sometimes the truth does not arrive by showing you more. Sometimes it arrives by showing you what can no longer be seen the same way. This is where the final week of August becomes useful, because instead of sitting around waiting for September to feel different, you can change the conditions before September even begins. One serious move made now can completely change what next month has to work with. Finish the thing you keep postponing. Make the call. Submit the application. Cut the expense. Start the routine. Have the conversation. Commit to the decision you keep circling around. It does not have to be dramatic, but it does have to be real enough that your life looks slightly different on September 1st than it does right now. Do not enter a new month asking for momentum. Enter it carrying proof that you already moved. That is the whole point of this final stretch. If August is closing with pressure, uncertainty, and a major eclipse, then use that pressure instead of just observing it. Make September deal with the version of you that already acted first. This week, one of the easiest ways to lose clarity is to spend too much time inside other people's certainty. The problem with crowds is not simply that people are distracting. It is that when enough people around you believe something strongly, their confidence can start to feel like evidence, even when nobody actually knows what is going to happen. One person is anxious, another is rushing, someone else is completely convinced that a decision has to be made now. and before you realize it, their urgency becomes your urgency. That is especially important during a week built around an eclipse, because the whole theme is incomplete information and changing perspective. If you are surrounded by too many voices, you can end up making an important decision just to escape the pressure of uncertainty. Not every strong feeling belongs to you just because you felt it strongly. That is why this final stretch of August may be better used noticing who influences your decisions. Pay attention to how differently you think when you are alone compared with when you are inside a group. Notice whether an idea still feels right after everyone stops talking about it. Notice whether your confidence stays the same when there is nobody around to validate it. Sometimes people do not change your mind by convincing you. They change your mind simply by repeating their certainty until it becomes difficult to hear your own hesitation. And that does not mean you need to isolate yourself from everyone. It simply means that this is probably not the week to let collective momentum make a personal decision for you. If something is important enough to affect September, then it deserves a moment where you can hear your own reasoning without 10 other people leaning on the scale. Borrowed confidence can make a bad decision feel strangely obvious. So if something suddenly feels urgent because everyone around you is treating it like an emergency, step away from the noise long enough to see whether the urgency survives. The decision that remains when the crowd disappears is probably the one worth paying attention to. August 29th and 30th sit in a strange middle space. Something may have become clearer on the 28th, but you still do not know what that clarity is going to require from you. You have seen something, noticed something, or understood something differently, but the consequence has not fully arrived yet. That is where people tend to rush. Uncertainty feels unfinished, and the mind hates unfinished things. So the instinct is to close the story as quickly as possible. You decide what something means, label the situation, make a conclusion about another person, or convince yourself that you already know what comes next. But that can be the exact mistake. Seeing the truth and knowing what to do with it are two completely different things. The 29th and 30th can be viewed as the corridor between recognition and responsibility. You may know that something has changed without knowing whether it needs action. You may realize a situation is not what you thought without immediately knowing what the correct response is. You may even feel tempted to make a dramatic move simply because sitting with uncertainty feels uncomfortable. That is why these days matter more than people give them credit for. The eclipse may reveal the problem, but the days after it test whether you can avoid inventing a solution too quickly. Sometimes the first answer after a revelation is not the final answer. Sometimes you need to see how the situation behaves once the emotional intensity of the eclipse has passed. Do not confuse the first conclusion with the final truth. And this is what keeps the week moving beyond August 28th, because the story is not finished when the eclipse ends. The real question is what remains once the excitement dies down, and whether what seemed obvious on the 28th still looks obvious on the 29th and 30th. Then August 31st arrives with the moon conjunct Saturn, and that is where consequence, responsibility, and commitment enter the picture. So the gap is not empty at all. It is the part where you find out whether what you saw during the eclipse was just a moment of intensity or something serious enough to follow you into the final day of August. One of the most interesting ways to think about an eclipse is not that something has to disappear from your life, but that something can stay exactly where it is and still lose the power it once had over you. That is a much more subtle kind of change, and honestly, it is often more important than some dramatic ending. An obsession can remain, but stop taking over your entire attention. You may still think about the person, the goal, the situation, or the outcome, but it no longer dominates every decision you make. The thing itself has not vanished. What changed is the amount of authority you gave it. An expectation can also be eclipsed. Maybe you thought someone had to respond a certain way. Maybe you were convinced something had to happen by a certain time. Maybe you had a very specific picture of how August was supposed to end. Then something shifts, and suddenly the expectation is still there, but you are no longer emotionally chained to it. Not everything leaves your life by disappearing. Some things leave by losing their importance. An obligation can work the same way. You may still have to do something, show up somewhere, deal with someone, or finish something you committed to. But the emotional weight around it can change. You stop making it bigger than it is. You stop letting one responsibility define your entire mood. And then there is illusion, which may be the most interesting category of all. An illusion does not always collapse in one dramatic moment. Sometimes you simply start seeing the cracks in it. Something can still look the same on the outside while you quietly stop believing in it the same way. That could be an image you had of another person, a story you kept telling yourself, a goal you thought would finally make everything better, or even a fear that seemed much more powerful before you looked at it closely. An illusion does not need to disappear before it stops controlling you. That is what makes this eclipse symbolism useful. The point is not that 4 things are definitely going to leave your life before August ends. That would be too simplistic. The more interesting possibility is that something remains present, but its rank changes. It moves from the center of your life to the background. It stops being the thing everything else revolves around. You still see it. You still know it is there. You just no longer give it the same power. And sometimes that is the real eclipse, not losing something, but finally seeing that it never deserved as much of you as you were giving it. A partial eclipse may actually be more interesting spiritually than a total eclipse, because totality gives you a clean image. Something disappears, darkness takes over, and then the light returns. A partial eclipse is messier than that. Part of the moon remains visible, part of it is covered, and you are forced to look at a picture that is incomplete without being completely hidden. And that is much closer to how real change usually happens. Most of the time, life does not hand you a perfectly clear answer all at once. You get a clue, then another clue. You notice something is off, but you cannot yet explain why. Someone says something that changes how you see them, but not enough for you to know exactly what it means. A situation starts moving in a different direction, but not far enough for you to know where it is going. That is where this eclipse becomes interesting, because partial information has a strange effect on people. The less we know, the more tempted we are to invent the rest. You hear half the story, and your mind immediately writes the ending. You notice someone acting differently and decide what their intention must be. You receive one piece of unexpected news and suddenly start predicting what will happen next. The problem is not that intuition is useless. The problem is that intuition and assumption can feel almost identical when you are emotionally invested in the outcome. Partial information becomes dangerous when imagination starts pretending to be evidence. And that is one of the strongest lessons hidden inside the word partial. Not everything needs to be revealed immediately for something important to be happening. Sometimes, just seeing one section of the truth is enough to realize that the explanation you have been relying on is incomplete. Maybe someone is not exactly who you thought they were, but that does not automatically mean they are the opposite either. Maybe an opportunity is changing, but that does not mean it is disappearing. Maybe a plan needs to be adjusted, but that does not mean it was a mistake. Maybe something you were completely certain about suddenly has one detail that no longer fits. That single detail can matter more than a dramatic answer. Because once one piece stops making sense, you are forced to look at everything else differently. One missing piece can change the meaning of the entire picture. This is why the days around the eclipse may reward patience more than certainty. If something happens that you cannot immediately explain, resist the urge to force it into a story just because unfinished situations are uncomfortable. Let it be incomplete for a moment. There is power in being able to say, I have seen enough to know something has changed, but I have not seen enough to decide exactly what it means. That is a much stronger position than pretending to know. And this applies to your own decisions too. You may realize you are no longer satisfied with something without immediately knowing what should replace it. You may recognize that a relationship needs to change without knowing what the new version of it looks like. You may know that one direction is closing without having another direction fully open yet. People often interpret that middle space as failure because there is no clean answer attached to it. But sometimes, uncertainty is simply evidence that the old answer has expired before the new one has fully arrived. Not every unanswered question is a warning. Some are proof that your old certainty is no longer enough. So do not underestimate the fact that this is a partial eclipse. Symbolically, it creates a week where fragments may matter, small details may matter, contradictions may matter. And this is where the week takes one final turn. Because if you assume everything ends with the eclipse on August 28th, you miss the way August actually closes. On August 31st, the moon meets Saturn, and symbolically, Saturn changes the entire mood of what came before it. The eclipse is dramatic because it changes what you see. Saturn is different. Saturn is concerned with what happens after you have seen it. In astrology, Saturn is connected with time, responsibility, limits, structure, commitment, consequence, and the uncomfortable reality that every choice eventually asks something from you. That makes its position at the very end of August especially interesting, because it arrives after the eclipse has already disturbed the picture. The order matters. First, something becomes difficult to see in the old way. Then you have 2 days where you are left sitting with whatever changed. Then Saturn arrives and asks whether you are actually prepared to respond to it. The eclipse reveals what changed. Saturn reveals what that change is going to cost. That cost does not necessarily mean something negative. It can simply mean responsibility. You may realize you want something different professionally, but now you need to develop the skill that makes it possible. You may realize that your financial situation needs to change, but now you have to make the boring decision you kept avoiding. You may finally see a relationship clearly, but now you have to decide what boundary that clarity requires. That is what Saturn does symbolically. It removes the fantasy that realization alone is enough. There is a big difference between understanding something and rearranging your life because of it. You can know exactly what needs to happen and still postpone it for 6 months. You can have a powerful realization and still wake up the next morning doing exactly what you did before. You can spend hours thinking about the future while quietly protecting every habit that keeps the future the same. Awareness without consequence is just entertainment. That is why August 31st matters so much to this narrative. The eclipse may be the event everyone watches, but Saturn represents the part nobody gets excited about, the follow-through. And follow-through is where things become real. You may have to choose between two things you genuinely want. You may have to accept that one option is no longer practical. You may have to stop waiting for perfect timing. You may have to commit to something before you feel completely ready. You may have to admit that a problem is not going to solve itself simply because you finally understand it. Saturn does not ask whether you had a revelation. Saturn asks what structure your revelation creates. The truth becomes real when it starts changing your calendar, your choices, your money, your boundaries, and your time. That is where this week becomes more than an eclipse story. Imagine something becomes clear on the 28th. Maybe you recognize that a goal is going to require more from you than you expected. Maybe you finally understand why a certain situation keeps repeating. Maybe someone's actions tell you something their words never did. That realization may feel powerful in the moment. But then, August 31st arrives, and suddenly the question is no longer, "What did I realize?" The question becomes, "What am I willing to do differently because I realized it?" That is a much harder question, because the moment you act on what you know, you create consequences. Saying yes to one thing means saying no to something else. Setting a boundary changes a relationship. Making a commitment changes your schedule. Every serious decision destroys at least one comfortable excuse. And if you're still here, still watching, I genuinely appreciate you. This final week of August is not about panicking over every sign or forcing every answer to appear at once. It is about noticing what still feels true after the intensity passes, what remains important when the noise settles, and what is actually worth carrying into September. Whatever this week reveals, trust that clarity does not always arrive instantly. Sometimes it proves itself slowly, and whatever is meant to stay in your life will not need fear to keep it there.